Good evening. Welcome to Jadelyn's Crash Course. Today we're going to talk about the history of Palestine and Israel and how the United States were involved in that process. We start in the 1920s, before the Holocaust started, before the World War happened. The United States was focusing on a new idea of Zionism. There was an acknowledgement of rising anti-Semitism in Europe towards the Jewish people in businesses or leadership positions. This was held by Germans specifically, but as it started to be recognized by soldiers and the American press, organizations started to gain traction. The Nazi Party that started to rise in the 1930s also had an idea. The Zionists share today a state for Jewish people to live that is not Europe, or that is not in Europe. It is due to the rise and the encouragement of anti-Semitic sentiment that Jewish people had to flee Palestine and start a new state. Before I make these statements, I'm going to provide some framing. After the Zionist movement started gaining traction, especially in the United States and Northern Europe, it was noted that the United States had created proxy political groups and organizations to fund the newly found Zionist militias before the Nakba, which I will get into after, selling them arms and promoting self-determination as the capital of liberalism. There was much political discourse, though, in the early 20th century due to the fear of communism and the acceptance of neoliberalism within international politics. This American support for Zionism was at the most harm to the Palestinians who had lived there for a very long time among three religions, thousands of denominations in a country together as neighbors. The Haganah was the most prominent. It is seen in the United States and is in Palestine as early as 1907 before the Holocaust, as the rise of anti-Semitism was prominent in European countries. When Israel received the news to the partition plan, they then started an aggressive move for the military groups to kill and displace Palestinians, but it did not become extreme until the partition plan. There were at least 33 massacres collected from first-hand accounts in Palestinian villages, and half of them before any Arab-backed militaries joined the fighting. An example of one of these massacres was in the town of Deir Yassin in April 1948, before any Palestinian or even Arab military started fighting. A Swiss Red Cross representative found 254 people dead, including 145 women and 35 of them pregnant. He reported that the attackers lined up families, including infants and grandparents, and shot them. According to the Red Cross representative, from his diary, he witnessed Zionist militia entering houses with guns and knives. He even saw one Jewish woman carrying a blood-covered dagger and saw another stab an old couple in their doorway after politely knocking. The Deir Yassin attack was perpetuated by two Zionist militias. The head of each, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, later became prime ministers of Israel. Begin, after admitting to killing 91 people in his time in the militia, came to a tour in America and was to be rejected from an American visa, but this was overruled by President Truman at the time. He was asked in an interview, how does it feel to be, in light of all that is going on, to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And he proclaimed, in the Middle East, in all the world. This provides a framing of Zionist ideas at the time. They started as early as 1915 in Europe, when the British were discussing freeing their colonized lands for Arab independence. In the course of the protracted correspondence, the Sheriff of Mecca unequivocally demanded the independence of Arab countries, specifying in detail the boundaries and the territories in question, which clearly included Palestine. It was referred to as Syria at the time, but it included the lands of Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt. This was confirmed by Mikaman, which was the person that worked with the Sheriff of Mecca, Hussein, and he said that Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of Arabs in all the regions with the limits demanded by the Sheriff of Mecca. This brought about the Hussein-Mikanan agreements and papers that were released while the Balfour Declaration was being drafted. These undertakings to the Zionist organizations were known in a declaration used by the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Arthur James Balfour, and due to the acts of Herbert Samuel and Lord Rothschild at the time, and the Zionist parastates getting established in Palestine, there was pressure from Zionist Europeans to start moving to Palestine from Sir Arthur James Balfour. When he wrote to Lord Rothschild in his little letter, he said that he sees a land for Jewish people to move to, and that was referenced as Palestine. At first, as said in the Balfour Declaration by Sir Arthur James Balfour, he wanted them to live alongside the Arabs and the Christians who already lived there. But this then turned very violent as militias started getting traction, power, and money to fund the Nakba, mostly from proxy United States paramilitary groups. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 181, which called for the partition into separate Muslim and Jewish states, with Jerusalem as an international city. While the United States is seen as not playing a significant role at the time, they provided unwavering support for this plan to give the Jewish people a homeland. With months after the partition vote took place, Zionist militia had forced out 413,000 people from the Palestinian territory, and the military units had prepared for war before the UN vote, had gotten massive weaponry from the aforementioned U.S. proxy groups. Throughout history, peace attempts were made by both sides within the time frame of the Nakba, and then two intifadas. The Nakba was the mass killing and slaughter of Palestinians after the partition, and that lasted until the end of Israel's war on independence, in total displacing 750,000 people, with tens of thousands of deaths of Palestinian resistance and civilians, including massacres and unjust illegal battles perpetuated by the Zionist militaries. One of the two enslaved states proclaimed its independence as Israel in the 1948 war involving the Arab states expanded to 77% territory over the Mandate Palestine, including the larger part of Jerusalem, and over half of the Palestinian Arab population fled or were expelled. Jordan and Egypt controlled the rest of the territory assigned by Resolution 181 to the Arab state. In 1967, Israel occupied these territories, Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which was subsequently annexed by Israel. This went completely against the Resolution 181 and against the partition plan previous. This war brought about the second exodus of Palestinians, estimated at 500,000, 500,000 people. The Security Council Resolution 242 in 1967 formulated the principles of a just and lasting peace, including an Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the conflict, a just settlement of the refugee problem, and the termination of all claims of states or belligerency. In 1937, hostilities were followed by the Security Council Resolution 338, which called for peace negotiations between parties concerned. In 1974, the General Assembly reaffirmed the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, national independence, sovereignty, and to return to their homeland. These talks eventually led to the Zionist military getting fed up with the lack of land, and then they started settlements and small fights, and again rebooted the war. After the first Intifada, there were peace talks within Oslo Accords between the Palestinian Authority and Israel for border disputes. These were ended when a radical Israeli extremist assassinated Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Yitzhak Rabin. This sparked the second Intifada because for once the Palestinians had approved of an Israeli Prime Minister who would work along them in a peaceful resolution. From the 1990s, the Palestinian Authority was enacted as a government in Palestine, with the Palestinian Liberation Organization being a completely different entity battling with Israel. The terrorist group Hamas, who was originally created by Israel and funded by Israel, turned against Israel and started launching small-scale attacks after Israel was forced to leave equipment in the West Bank and Gaza after the declaration of reversal and annexation. This included sabotaging parts of their own government, building walls to keep Palestinians within Gaza and the West Bank, holding full control of the public systems that were subject to damage because of Israel's lack of support, because of Hamas's infiltration into the Palestinian Authority, and then later the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the joining of the two. With the sanctioning and the interference from the Zionist militias and the Hamas militia, and Israeli military picking proxy fights with the PLO representatives, this resulted in about 9,000 total Palestinian deaths from 2005 to 2022. These deaths were mostly due to the lack of intelligence on Israel's side, mistaking civilians for Hamas members. The Palestinian liberation slowly started to degrade as they lost any support from non-governmental organizations and were slowly backed into a corner by Israel's strict resolutions. This brewed for Hamas to rise. They presented at first as a solution and a replacement for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and then started to commit heinous terrorist acts after being voted in by a very small percentage of the population. In 2008, an Israeli ground invasion began on the 3rd of January, and on the 5th of January, the IDF began operating in the densely populated urban centers of Gaza. This is a problem because they're the most densely populated areas in the world. Israel mostly hit targets it had damaged before and struck Palestinian rocket launching units, but Hamas intensified its rocket and mortar attacks against mostly civilian targets in southern Israel, losing legitimacy as a protector of Palestine, and same with Israel losing legitimacy as an army from a state. Israeli politicians immediately decided against striking deeper within Gaza and concerns of higher casualties on both sides and rising international criticism. The conflict ended on 18th of January when the IDF first declared a unilateral ceasefire, followed by Hamas announcing a one-week ceasefire 12 hours later. The IDF completed its withdrawal on the 21st of January. In September 2009, a UN special mission headed by the South African Justice Richard Goldstone produced a report accusing both Palestinian militants and the Israeli army of war crimes and possible crimes against humanity, and recommended bringing those responsible to justice. Nothing ever came about with that. The Gaza war in 2008, due to Hamas sending missiles and other deadly strikes into southern Israel, as a result to Israel attacking and annexing parts of northern Gaza and the West Bank, created a back-and-forth battle from Hamas and Israel, and also creates a sort of sentiment for Americans to make excuses for Israel. And this only lasted until Hamas kept attacking and fighting for Palestine's independence because they're an anti-colonial organization. Then the heinous act of October 7th was committed by Hamas. This gained international attention, even though the war and small battles had been happening for decades. This terrorist act killed 1,200 Israelis, innocent civilian Israelis, starting the newest war, now killing 34,000 Palestinian civilians, with only 7,000 Hamas militants killed. This number includes 17,000 children. This is where the interference of larger powers has led the United States sending Israel military equipment, billions of dollars, funding their education system, and making their economy reliant on U.S. aid. This, in light of other tragedies supported by the U.S., including the Haitian situation, the attack on Ukraine by Russia, and the Venezuelan political crises, have proven that the United States needs to stand up against its government, and it needs to show them that it is not okay to keep supporting these genocides. This video has provided an overview of the constant violence that is perpetuated in Israel, how it has been affected by the United States and Britain. This video should also prove as a call for action, call for peace in the region, and a call for a two-state solution for the Palestinians having the right to self-determination, and the Jewish people having a place to call home, with the international city being kept neutral as its own entity where all religions should be able to practice and enter freely. This is a call to remove the inhumane checkpoints to travel throughout Gaza and West Bank, with an emphasis on the IDF to stop their siege in Gaza, stop the genocide, and stop the ethnic cleansing. This has been my Crash Course. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned a lot. Please act now.